Everyone called him crazy for building a shelter no one wanted. They laughed, shook their heads, and walked away. But when winter came harder than anyone expected, this quiet man and his German shepherd were the only ones who didn't panic. This isn't a story about proving people wrong. It's about what happens when preparation meets time. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're so curious about it. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Winter returned early, hard and unforgiving, pressing cold into the mountains like a living weight, sealing roads, dulling sound, and reminding everything that survived here that mercy was never part of the season. Jack Turner noticed it first in the silence. At 62, silence had become familiar to him, but this one was different, thicker, heavier, the kind that settled before something broke. His cabin sat alone near the tree line, a squat, weather-darkened structure of old pine logs and stone, its roof bowed slightly under years of snow loads, its windows small and practical rather than welcoming. Jack had chosen the place for isolation, not beauty. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered even now, though time and injury had softened the edges of what had once been an imposing frame. His hair, once dark, had gone mostly gray, cut short out of habit rather than vanity, and his beard came in coarse and uneven, more steel than white, framing a face carved by years of cold, stress, and decisions made under pressure. His eyes were pale, watchful, and rarely still, the kind of eyes that measured rooms and exits without conscious effort. People who had known him before the mountains said he'd always been quiet, but that wasn't entirely true. Before the incident, the one no one talked about anymore, Jack Turner had been sharp-tongued, direct, the kind of SWAT officer who filled space with authority without raising his voice. After retirement, after the knee injury that never healed right, and the operation that ended his career overnight, the sharpness turned inward. He spoke less, not because he had nothing to say, but because saying it no longer changed anything. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and machine oil. The heater clicked and rattled, struggling in a way Jack didn't like. He crouched near it, testing the vent with the back of his hand, feeling the uneven heat. Mechanical failure didn't scare him, but unpredictability did. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. The storm warning crackled faintly from the weather radio on the counter, the voice calm and detached as it described wind speeds, pressure drops, and snowfall totals that meant nothing to people who didn't live where trees froze standing up. Jack listened anyway, absorbing the cadence, the pauses, historical, severe, life-threatening. He shut it off before the advisory finished. He already knew what was coming. Hope watched him from the doorway, her body angled toward him even when her attention drifted elsewhere. She was a German shepherd, just past 8 years old, her muzzle dark with a dusting of gray that mirrored Jack's beard. Her coat was thick and well-kept, black and tan dulled slightly by age, her ears still sharp and upright, her eyes deep brown and alert. She moved with controlled economy, every step deliberate, the posture of a dog trained to work rather than wander. Hope had been a K9 once, same as Jack had been SWAT. And like him, she carried herself as if retirement were just another temporary assignment. She was calmer now, slower to spring, but when Jack shifted his weight and winced, her head lifted instantly, eyes narrowing with concern. She didn't whine. She never did. That had been drilled out of her long ago, replaced by watchfulness and quiet endurance. Jack straightened, favoring his left leg, and reached for the emergency pack hanging on a peg by the door. He checked it methodically, not because he expected to leave, but because routine kept his hands steady when his thoughts threatened to wander. Flashlight, working, batteries, sealed, medical kit, restocked last fall, flares, thermal blanket, water purifier. Each item went back in place with practiced precision. Hope stepped closer, nose brushing his sleeve, inhaling the familiar sense of canvas, metal, and old sweat. "Not yet," Jack murmured, his voice low and rough from disuse. He wasn't talking to her so much as anchoring himself. The knee twinged again, a sharp reminder of the stairwell breach years ago, the one that ended with a body bag and a commendation that sat unopened in a drawer somewhere. That was the night everything changed. when the rules he'd trusted failed and improvisation came too late. He had learned then that preparation wasn't paranoia, it was respect for reality. Outside, wind threaded through the trees, rising in pitch. Snow began to fall, slow at first, flakes wide and deliberate, as if testing the ground before committing. Jack moved to the window and watched the forest blur. Each familiar landmark softened, erased inch by inch. He didn't feel fear. Fear required surprise, and there was none left in him. What he felt was focus. He adjusted the damper on the stove, then moved to the breaker panel, flipping switches to isolate non-essential circuits. The heater coughed again, then steadied, but Jack made a note in his head. Temporary. Unreliable. He knelt with effort and braced himself against the counter until the pain subsided. Hope pressed her flank against his leg, solid and warm, offering balance without instruction. She'd learned that too. Good girl, he said, quieter still. The words carried weight because he didn't use them often. The radio remained silent now, but the air pressure drop pressed against his ears like altitude. Jack slung the pack over one shoulder, testing the weight, then set it down by the door where it belonged. Not panic. Readiness. He scanned the room one last time, committing details to memory the way he always had before a call-out. If he had to move, he would. If he didn't, he'd ride it out. Either way, he wouldn't be caught off guard. Hope sat at his side, posture straight, eyes on him, waiting for the cue she trusted more than instinct. Outside, winter tightened its grip, and the mountains went quiet in a way that promised nothing good. Jack Turner rested his hand briefly on Hope's head, steadying himself, and turned back to the work of being prepared. By mid-morning, the snow had thickened enough to mute distance, but not enough to stop movement. Jack Turner loaded the last of his supplies into the back of his aging pickup, working slowly, deliberately, each motion measured against the dull ache in his left knee. The truck was old, paint faded to the color of wet ash, but the engine still turned over cleanly, and that was what mattered. Machines either worked or they didn't. People were more complicated. Hope waited near the driver's door, her breath fogging in steady rhythm, ears turning toward every sound that cut through the wind. The road into town was already beginning to disappear under fresh snow, the edges softened, the center line erased. Jack drove anyway. He had one final stop to make, and it wasn't something he trusted to chance. The gas station sat at the edge of the valley, a low concrete building with a single pump island and windows clouded by years of dust and cigarette smoke. It was the kind of place that survived on habit rather than traffic. Jack parked close, eased himself out of the truck, and paused until the pressure in his knee settled into something manageable. Hope jumped down without waiting for command, positioning herself just off his left side, close enough to brace him if he faltered. Inside, the air smelled of fuel, burnt coffee, and old paper. A bell chimed weakly as the door opened. Behind the counter stood a man Jack had seen before, but never spoken to. His name was Frank Collins, though Jack only knew that because the town was small and names traveled faster than weather. Frank was in his late 50s, thick through the middle, with a red, wind-chapped face and a mustache that had gone yellow at the edges from years of nicotine. His hairline had retreated unevenly, leaving tufts of gray that curled over his ears. Frank had once worked construction until a fall from scaffolding left him with a permanent limp and a bitterness he carried like a badge. He leaned on the counter now, coffee mug in hand, eyes tracking Jack with open curiosity. "Storm's coming in fast," Frank said, not unkindly, but with the detached tone of someone commenting on a television forecast rather than a threat. Jack nodded. He paid for fuel, batteries, and a last-minute bag of ice melt, keeping his responses minimal. He could feel Frank watching Hope, the way people always did when they recognized a working dog. "That's a shepherd, right?" Frank asked. "Used to have one. Smart dogs?" "Still are," Jack replied. Frank's gaze drifted back to Jack's truck, lingering on the reinforced suspension, the extra fuel cans strapped down tight. Then he smiled, the kind that didn't reach the eyes. "Heard you built yourself a bunker up there," he said, voice dropping slightly, as if sharing gossip instead of judgment. Jack didn't answer immediately. He felt Hope shift her weight, sensing the change in tension. Frank chuckled softly. "A bunker? At your age? You planning to hide from the world?" The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Jack met Frank's eyes then, steady and unblinking. "No," he said. "I'm planning to survive it." The silence that followed stretched longer than comfort allowed. Frank snorted, shook his head, and lifted his mug. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Jack turned away without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow sideways in thin white sheets. The drive back was slower. Visibility dropped mile by mile, landmarks dissolving into vague shadows. Jack turned off the main road well before the cabin, following a narrower track that climbed toward the rock face where the shelter was hidden. He parked under a stand of pines, killed the engine, and began the careful process of unloading. The concrete shelter was half buried into the stone, its entrance angled away from prevailing winds, reinforced with steel Jack had salvaged and hauled himself over multiple summers. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a scar in the rock, easily missed if you didn't know where to look. Inside, it was dry, cold but stable, and quiet in a way the cabin never was during storms. Jack carried the first crate in, set it down, and returned for another. The snow was coming harder now, flakes dense and stinging, visibility shrinking to a few yards. On the third trip, his boot slipped on ice hidden beneath fresh powder. The pain came sharp and immediate, a white-hot flare that stole his breath and dropped him to one knee. He hissed through clenched teeth, hands slamming against the ground to keep from falling completely. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of his own breathing and the roar of blood in his ears. He stayed there, crouched and shaking, until the worst of it passed. When he tried to stand, his leg buckled. Hope was there instantly. She pressed her shoulder against his side, braced her stance, and waited. Jack shifted his weight slowly, using her solid frame as leverage. "Easy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Snow piled fast, coating his jacket, dusting Hope's back. The wind howled down the rock face, funneling into the trees with rising violence. Jack grabbed the crate, dragged it the rest of the way, and leaned heavily against the shelter wall once inside. He closed the steel door behind them, sealing out the sound in one abrupt motion. The quiet inside was profound, broken only by the slow tick of cooling metal and Hope's steady breathing. Jack slid down onto a bench, leg extended, jaw tight as he rode out the pain. He unstrapped his knee brace with careful fingers, adjusted it, and waited until sensation returned in manageable waves. Hope stood watch near the door, ears forward, eyes fixed on nothing Jack could see. "You did good," he said quietly. Outside, the storm intensified, wind screaming across the mountain like something alive and angry. Snow filled the last visible traces of the path he had used, erasing it completely. Jack knew then that there would be no turning back until the storm decided to let go. He rested his head briefly against the cold concrete wall, feeling its solidity, its refusal to yield. The shelter had been mocked because it was unseen, because it didn't look like safety to people who measured protection by appearance rather than function. Jack closed his eyes, pain pulsing in time with the wind beyond the door, and allowed himself one small private certainty. Let them laugh. He was exactly where he needed to be. The first night passed without mercy. Wind hammered the mountain in relentless waves, the sound compressed and distorted by stone until it became something deeper than noise, something that felt alive. Inside the concrete shelter, time slowed to the rhythm of Jack Turner's breathing and the steady scrape of Hope's claws as she shifted position. The temperature inside held steady, cold but survivable, the kind of cold that demanded awareness rather than panic. Jack sat on the narrow cot he'd built along the wall, his injured leg elevated, knee wrapped tight. Fever crept in by degrees, subtle at first, then insistent, a dull heat beneath his skin that left his thoughts sluggish at the edges. He recognized the signs immediately. Infection didn't care about timing. Hope remained close, her body angled toward him, head resting on her paws, eyes never fully closing. She lifted her head each time Jack moved, tracking him with quiet vigilance. Jack forced himself through routine, because routine was the only thing that kept fear from taking shape. He inventoried supplies again, checked the battery charge on the lanterns, rationed water by habit rather than necessity. Outside, the storm erased the world, There was no sense of dawn or dusk, only variations in the violence of the wind. Snow pressed against the sealed entrance, building layer upon layer, insulating the shelter while trapping them in place. By the second day, Jack's fever worsened. His joints ached, every movement costly. He moved anyway, slow and deliberate, because stillness bred weakness. He heated soup, sipped it carefully, and forced down calories he didn't want. Hope ate when he told her to, drank when he set the bowl down, then returned to her watch. Late into the second night, a sound cut through the static silence inside the shelter. It was faint, irregular, almost imagined. Jack froze, head lifting, breath held. The sound came again, a broken hiss followed by a fragment of voice. He turned toward the far wall, where an old emergency radio sat bolted into a metal shelf, its casing scratched and dulled from years of disuse. He hadn't expected it to work. He'd kept it maintained out of habit, not hope. Jack crossed the room, fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the dial. Static surged, then thinned. A voice emerged, weak and distorted, struggling against interference. "Anyone can hear stuck?" Jack leaned closer, heart pounding in a way the fever couldn't explain. He adjusted frequency, fine-tuning with care learned long before retirement, the voice sharpened enough to understand fragments. 2 people, adults, trapped in a remote cabin several miles north, roof partially collapsed, supplies low. The transmission cut in and out, barely holding. Jack closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the decision settling heavy in his chest. The storm was still raging. Visibility outside would be near zero. His knee was unstable, his body compromised by fever. Every survival instinct told him to stay put. He looked at Hope. She was already on her feet, ears forward, body tense, as if the choice had been made without words. Jack exhaled slowly. "Not yet," he said, voice hoarse. "We wait for a break." The third day arrived without ceremony. The wind shifted, its pitch changing, violence giving way to something more uneven. The storm was weakening, but it wasn't done. Jack checked the radio again. The signal was still there, weaker now, intermittent. The voice on the other end sounded older than he'd first thought, strained with cold and exhaustion. Jack gathered his gear with careful precision. He layered clothing, strapped on his knee brace, tested his weight slowly. Pain flared, but he could bear it. He always had. Hope stood ready, tail low, muscles coiled. Jack opened the inner door and stopped. The outer seal would be buried. He took a breath, braced himself, and forced it open. Snow spilled inward, knee-deep, biting and sharp. The world beyond was white chaos, the horizon erased, sound flattened. Jack moved forward one step at a time, following a route etched into memory during summers when the mountain had been forgiving. Hope ranged ahead, nose low, cutting through drifts with practiced efficiency. She paused often, checking back, recalibrating. The cabin came into view as a darker smear against the white, nearly lost beneath snow. Jack reached it on shaking legs. He pounded on the door, shoulder burning with effort, then forced it open. Inside were 2 figures huddled together beneath blankets. The man was in his late 60s, lean to the point of gauntness, with a gray beard gone wild and skin pale beneath frost-reddened cheeks. His name was Eli Harper, once a surveyor, now retired, stubbornly independent to a fault. His hands shook uncontrollably, eyes bright with fear and relief in equal measure. Beside him was a woman slightly younger, mid-60s, narrow-shouldered, hair cut short and silver, her face lined but composed despite the cold. Her name was Margaret Hale, a former librarian whose calm had been shaped by years of order and quiet resilience. Both were hypothermic, exhausted, but alive. Jack worked quickly, efficiency overriding pain. He wrapped them in thermal blankets, shared his remaining soup, and spoke in a steady tone that allowed no argument. "You're coming with me," he said. There was no room for debate. The return trip was slower. Jack leaned heavily on Hope when his knee threatened to give out. Margaret stayed close, her hand gripping Hope's harness, while Eli followed with Jack's guidance, each step measured. The shelter door closed behind them with a final, sealing thud. Inside, warmth returned by degrees. Jack slumped onto the cot, fever crashing over him in a wave he couldn't fully control. Hope stayed with him while Margaret and Eli settled in, the shelter holding all four of them in its unyielding grip. Outside, the storm howled its last threats. Inside, survival took shape in silence. The shelter changed the moment the door sealed behind them. What had been a place of quiet endurance became a fragile system that demanded order. Jack Turner felt it immediately, the way he always had when a room filled with variables. Pain pulsed behind his eyes, fever pressing close, but his mind sharpened, sliding into a familiar channel carved by years of command. He pushed himself upright from the cot, ignoring the protest in his knee, and took stock. Eli Harper slumped on the bench near the far wall, shoulders hunched, breathing shallow and uneven. His beard was rimmed with frost that melted slowly, leaving damp trails on his jacket. He tried to speak, failed, and nodded instead, pride intact, even as his body betrayed him. Margaret Hale stood closer to the center of the shelter, blanket wrapped tight around her narrow frame, posture rigid but controlled. Her eyes were clear, observant, taking in details with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to information. She had removed her gloves and rubbed Eli's hands methodically, coaxing circulation back with steady pressure. Hope positioned herself between Jack and the door, stance alert, head high, tail low, every muscle tuned to the space. Jack cleared his throat, voice rough but steady. "We're safe here," he said. "Temperature's stable. You're out of the wind." He gestured toward the benches. "Sit. Slow breaths, no sudden movement." His tone left no room for panic. Margaret nodded immediately. Eli managed a tight smile that collapsed into a shiver. Jack moved with measured steps to the supply shelf, distributing dry layers, thermal blankets, and water. He demonstrated rather than explained, because explanation cost time and energy. When he crouched to adjust Eli's boots, a sharp spike of pain shot up his leg, stealing his breath. He held still until it passed, jaw clenched, then finished the task. Margaret noticed. She always noticed. "You're injured," she said quietly, not accusing, simply stating fact. Jack shook his head once. Later. He heated water, mixed electrolyte powder, and handed cups around. The shelter hummed faintly with the sound of wind pressing against buried concrete, but inside, the air grew calmer by degrees. Eli's breathing steadied. Margaret's shoulders lowered a fraction. Hope relaxed just enough to lie down, chin on her paws, eyes never leaving Jack. As the adrenaline faded, the fever surged. Jack felt it wash through him, heavy and insistent. He sat, then leaned back, vision narrowing at the edges. Margaret moved without being asked, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, checking the bandage at his knee with gentle competence. "You need to rest," she said. Jack didn't argue. He closed his eyes, letting the shelter hold the pieces together. Time passed in fragments, wind rose and fell. Snow settled. When Jack woke, the shelter lights glowed dim and steady. His fever had eased slightly, pain dulled to something manageable. Margaret sat nearby, reading from a small notebook she'd carried, her voice low, words chosen to occupy the mind rather than demand it. Eli slept, breath deep and regular. Jack listened, orienting himself, then spoke. "We wait for daylight." Margaret looked up. "And then?" Jack opened his eyes. "Then we assess." He tried to stand and succeeded only with Hope's immediate support. She pressed in, solid and warm, adjusting her weight to his. He tested his knee, careful, then nodded. "Good," he murmured. Outside, the storm had lost its edge. Wind still moved the mountain, but the violence had softened. Visibility would be poor, but survivable. Jack made the decision without ceremony. "We checked the entrance," he said. "Not far, just to see." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Eli opened his eyes, confusion giving way to understanding. "You saved us," he rasped. Jack shook his head. "Not done yet." They moved in stages. Jack opened the inner door, then the outer, clearing packed snow with short, efficient motions. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. Hope stepped out first, scanning, then signaled back with a brief glance. The entrance passage held. Snow had drifted but not collapsed. Jack ventured a few steps beyond, the world muted and pale. He listened, counting seconds between gusts, reading the mountain the way he'd once read streets. Satisfied, he turned back. The return to the shelter was harder. The effort cost him more than he wanted to admit. By the time the door sealed again, his hands shook. Margaret took his arm without comment, guiding him to the bench. "You don't have to prove anything," she said softly. Jack met her eyes. "I know." He lay back, exhaustion pulling him under. When he woke again, the storm had broken. Light filtered faintly through the entrance passage, diffuse and gray. The radio crackled to life, stronger now, carrying weather updates and distant voices. Jack listened, then shut it off. "We're not moving yet," he said, "but help will come." Eli laughed weakly. "Never thought I'd owe my life to a man everyone called crazy." Jack's mouth twitched. "People confuse quiet preparation with fear," he said. "They're wrong." He rested his hand on Hope's head, feeling the steady thrum of life beneath her fur. The shelter held, unyielding, while the mountain began to release its grip. Jack Turner closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in resolve. Whatever came next, he would meet it prepared. Morning returned in pieces. Light filtered into the entrance passage in muted gray bands, the kind that didn't promise warmth but did promise continuity. The storm had spent itself, leaving behind a landscape altered beyond recognition. Snow lay in deep sculpted drifts, wind-carved and silent, the mountain holding its breath after violence. Inside the shelter, Jack Turner woke slowly, fever finally broken, pain dulled to a manageable throb. He tested his leg, careful, then sat up. Hope was already awake, seated near the door, posture relaxed for the first time since the storm began. Her ears tilted toward the outside world, reading information Jack could not. The radio crackled to life again, stronger now, the voice clear enough to recognize cadence rather than fragments. Emergency services were mobilizing. Roads were impassable. Rescue would take time. Jack shut the radio off and let the quiet settle. Margaret Hale moved with deliberate calm, folding blankets, organizing supplies with the same quiet order she'd maintained throughout the worst of it. She looked rested now, eyes clearer, shoulders no longer drawn tight. Eli Harper sat near the bench, sipping warm water, color slowly returning to his cheeks. He glanced around the shelter with a new expression, something between gratitude and disbelief. "You built this," he said, not as a question. Jack nodded once. "Over a few summers." Eli shook his head. "People laughed," he said. "I remember hearing about it." Jack's mouth twitched. "They still do." Margaret stepped closer, resting a hand briefly on the cold concrete wall. "This place feels older than you," she said. Jack hesitated, then nodded toward the rear of the shelter where the stonework changed, less uniform, more scarred. "Because it is," he said. He hadn't planned on telling the story, but the truth sat heavy in the space, waiting. "This wasn't my idea originally. The first survey showed remnants, tool marks, old supports. Miners used this as a winter refuge decades ago. After a collapse further in, men died. The site was abandoned. People called it cursed." Eli swallowed. "That's why the land was cheap." "That's why no one wanted it," Jack said. "They saw danger. I saw structure." Margaret considered that, then nodded. "History doesn't make a place weak," she said. "Ignoring it does." Jack met her eyes, surprised, then looked away. Outside, the mountain released a low shifting sound as snow settled, the final movements of a storm already turning into memory. Hours later, the sound of engines cut through the quiet. Distant at first, then unmistakable. Jack rose, leaning on Hope, and opened the shelter door. Cold air rushed in, sharp but clean. Down the slope, emergency vehicles crawled along the carved path, lights muted by snow but unmistakable. Jack raised an arm once, then waited. When the rescuers reached them, their reactions were a mix of disbelief and relief. They asked questions Jack answered simply. The shelter, the supplies, the timing. Eli and Margaret were guided out carefully, wrapped and assessed. One of the responders, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and frost-reddened cheeks, looked back at the shelter entrance. "This held?" she asked. Jack nodded. She let out a low whistle. "Better than half the structures we checked." Word traveled fast after that. In a town that small, survival stories always did. Jack didn't stay to hear it. He returned to his cabin only long enough to gather essentials, then came back to the shelter, moving slowly, deliberately. By the time the road was cleared days later, the narrative had already shifted. The bunker, the crazy old SWAT, the dog. People came by, not to laugh, but to look. Some asked questions. Jack answered when he could. He didn't correct their assumptions. He didn't need to. Frank Collins stopped by one afternoon, standing awkwardly near the entrance, hat in hand. He looked smaller without the counter between them. "Heard you saved some folks," he said. Jack shrugged. "They saved themselves by asking for help." Frank nodded, then cleared his throat. "I was wrong," he said. Jack considered him for a moment, then nodded once. It was enough. As winter loosened its grip, the shelter changed purpose. It became a reference point, a contingency plan. The town council approached Jack quietly, respectfully, asking if the shelter could be designated as an emergency refuge. Jack agreed on one condition, that it remain what it had always been: practical, quiet, prepared. Margaret and Eli visited before leaving town, both moving stronger now. Margaret handed Jack a small notebook. "You should write this down," she said. "People forget why things matter." Jack smiled faintly. Eli scratched hope behind the ears, gratitude written plainly across his weathered face. When they left, the shelter returned to silence. Jack sat on the bench, hope at his side, the mountain steady around them. He thought of the laughter, the doubt, the names people used when they didn't understand. He thought of the old miners who had carved safety into stone and paid for it with their lives. He rested his hand on the concrete wall, feeling its unyielding strength. Outside, winter retreated inch by inch. Jack Turner didn't feel triumphant. He felt validated. The difference mattered. He stood slowly, pain present but no longer defining, and looked at Hope. "We're staying," he said. She wagged her tail once, restrained but certain. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the snow, Jack closed the shelter door gently, not to hide but to protect. Mockery had been loud, preparation had been silent, winter had chosen which one mattered. The message at the heart of this story is simple but often forgotten. The things that truly protect us are rarely the ones that look impressive on the surface. Preparation is quiet. Discipline is invisible. And the people who think ahead are usually the ones others laugh at, until the moment comes when being ready is the only thing that matters. In everyday life, this isn't just about storms or survival shelters. It's about saving when others spend, learning when others mock, staying steady when others chase noise, and doing the unglamorous work that no one applauds. The world rewards attention, but life rewards readiness. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who believes in planning over pride. Leave a comment and tell us what being prepared means in your own life. And if you value stories that remind us why quiet strength still matters, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and Happy New Year.